Sometimes I find myself at a levaya, and there are numerous people who are crying that I never even knew, particularly had anything to do with a person who was being eulogized. And many, many years ago, I realized that such people at a levaya, at a funeral, are not necessarily crying for the nifter or the niftera, for the person who has passed away, so much as they're crying for themselves. Case in point, after the taking of Dinah, Yaakov Avinu was instructed by Kadosh Baruch Hu to rise and to return to Beisel. Yaakov Avinu does so. He sets up in his Mizbeach an altar, and then they begin to travel toward Eretz Yisrael. And when they arrive at a place called Luz in the land of Canaan, which is Beit El, the Pasuk tells us, indeed, he has constructed the Mizbeach, the altar, and suddenly, Vatamas Devora Menekas Rivka, Devora, the nursemaid of Rivka, passed away. Atikaver mitachas aves el tachasa alone, and she is buried at the bottom of a mountain within the plain of the area. Vayikra Shemo Alon Bachus, and Yaakov Avinu entitles the place in which she is buried as Alon Bachus, as the plain, not simply of a tear, but rather great wailing, great mourning, great loss. Alon Bachus, endless crying. Why is he crying endlessly? And the Ramban explains that Yaakov Avinu is not crying so much for the loss of Rivka, who was the nursemaid of his mother, as he is crying, as Rashi explains, that Rivka sent Devora to retrieve Yaakov Avinu, telling him that it was all right for him to return, for the wrath of Esav had somewhat declined. However, then Rivka passed away. It says in Ramban, Yaakov Avinu realizes he's finally coming home. But as much as he's coming home for his respected and revered and righteous father, Yitzchak Avinu, he was looking forward to coming home to the mother, who always saw the difference between himself and his older brother, Esav, who always coddled him, who always loved him, who surreptitiously saw to it that he would receive the brachas from his father, Yitzchak, instead of Esav, and who then sent him packing to save his life, because Esav was planning on killing him, and she said, run! I will tell your father that I wish for him to send you to Aram Naharaim to find for yourself a wife, but run for your life! And I will cry every day, as it were, until you return. And Yaakov Avinu is finally coming home. But as the Ramban so significantly says, that ultimately we are told that Yaakov Avinu returns home, but he returns home to the house of his father Yitzchak, but he cannot return home to the house of his mother Rivka, for she is no longer alive. And therefore Yaakov, in essence, is crying at the funeral of Devora, the nursemaid of his mother Rivka, because he's crying for Rivka that he has lost. And here, the Netziv in his Harchav Davar shares something brilliant with us, and he says to us, there are times in life when we are at a funeral, and we didn't know the person well, but the person is an Adam Kosher, and the Gemara in Shabbos tells us that Kol HaMoreh Demos, any person who sheds tears on behalf of an individual who was an upright person. Why the Gemara tells us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Sofron Menichan Beveis Ganazim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes those tears, he numbers them, they're so valued and cherished by him, and he places them in his, capital H, in God's flask, as it were, in his treasury. Shenemar, as a pasuk from Tehillim, says, David HaMelech said to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Nodi sofarta ata, sima demasi benodecha, halo b'sifrasecha. Nodi sofarta ata, you have counted HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you've seen how I've been reduced to be a novanad, a migrant, constantly going from place to place to place. And you have witnessed that, and you have seen my tears as I bed down for the night, knowing that tomorrow I need to find a different place, not to be killed or captured. And you have taken those tears and you've placed them in a flask, sufficiently important that you have counted them. It says the Harkav Davar, David HaMelech said to Kodesh Baruch Hu, God, whenever I chance upon an Adam Kasher, a person who's being buried, and he lived the proper life, I cry. But I know that even though I'm crying, and I'm doing so at the time, and it would appear to all others that I'm crying for the person being interred, I'm really crying for myself. And it's an opportunity for my own tears to well up and find an avenue of exit, to cry from the bottom of my heart for my own lot in life, even though it's at the funeral of another. And it counts, and it's fine. If that's the case, said the Harkav Davar, Yaakov Avinu and his sons and his children were crying, Yaakov for the mother to whom he could not return, whom he knew so well. No doubt his best friend. And the children of Yaakov Avinu crying for the grandmother who had given birth to Yaakov and made him whom he was, that they would never, ever, ever get a chance to meet. So they were crying for themselves and for Rivka. However, I saw beautifully, as explained by the Rav Zatzal, by Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Yoshe Ber, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, that all of these stories that we read, and time and again, it is emphasized that Rivka, the daughter of Besuel, who stemmed from Nachor. And it's a house of Avodah Zarah. And her brother is no less than a Lavan, who's anything but white. And yet she emerges to be able to be the second of the Imahos, the second matriarch, and to raise a son, Yaakov Avinu. Said the Rav, wherein did Rivka, Taka, end up being a Rivka? How did she end up being Rivka so different, so opposite from the household in which she was raised, as suggested the Rav? There was an underground to be found in the community of Avodah Zarah. There was an underground of people who were discovering the Messiah Sabare, the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they stood tall and they stood firm, in differing from all those who surrounded them, and in raising whom they did. And one who numbered amongst them was no less than Devorah Meinekes Rivka. Devorah, the not simply maidservant, but the person who nourished, nursemaid, the person who nourished the chinuch education of Rivka and helped make Rivka who she was. And if that's the case, then we understand that when Yaakov Avinu and his sons cry endless tears by the burial for Devorah, they're crying indeed for the mother and the bubby that they did not get to be reunited with. But they are as well crying, not simply for themselves, but for Devorah, because they appreciated that it was specifically this Devorah who raised that mother and grandmother, whom the grandchildren never got to meet, but in whose arms and in whose life Yaakov Avinu was bathed in love, proper chinuch, proper education, and proper avodas Hashem. So in this instance, indeed, they cried for themselves, and they cried for Devorah. What an alon bachus. Have a good Shabbos.